Hello and welcome to the course of world history. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson, and today we are digging into the Mexican Revolution, or at least the early phases of it, in our ongoing discussion of the Age of Revolutions. So our essential question today looks at the changes in Mexico between 1810 and 1872. Those familiar with the Mexican Revolution will know that it does extend beyond this, but we are narrowing our scope to just this period. All right, so back at the beginning, revolt in Mexico. Remember that Mexico was a colony of Spain, but that begins to change in 1810. It begins because of a revolt, largely amongst the mestizo population, that mixed Spanish Native American population within Mexico around 1810. Now, if you remember that hierarchy of social class within New Spain, we would know that the mestizos are down near the bottom. This is largely the working class within Mexico. Now, this revolt is led by a priest, Miguel Hidalgo, this handsome fellow right here. And he leads this rebellion after looking into the French Revolution, which had been ongoing for some time. Now, Hidalgo's revolt is crushed. This is not a successful revolt. And Hidalgo himself is executed. But the movement inspires others, and there will be kind of an ongoing series of revolts from 1810 on. It is because of this influence and this kicking off of the Mexican Revolution that it is his uprising that marks the beginning of Mexican Independence Day, even though his particular revolt was unsuccessful. Now, ongoing series of revolts continue. But it starts to shift from being led by the mestizo population to the Creole Peninsular population. And that is in part because of the inspiration by Hidalgo, right? The Mexican people are ready to rebel, but also out of fear that any revolution would be led by the mestizos. When Spain starts to really weaken in the Napoleonic Wars, particularly after the Peninsular Wars, Mexican Creoles and Peninsulares see this opportunity. They launch their own rebellions, and it winds up being this Creole Peninsular rebellion that becomes successful. In 1821, it is essentially done, and the leaders of this rebellion are able to formally declare Mexican independence in a way that can't seriously be contested from that point forward. This new nation is going to be led by a Creole general, this fellow right here, Agustin de Iturbide. Now, in 1822, the year after declaring independence, Iturbide has established his government and declares himself to be the Emperor of Mexico. He wants to go in that imperial monarchical route and lead the Empire of Mexico. But by this time, Mexico does have a Congress, a leading group of largely planter class, aristocrat, former Peninsular Creole individuals who have gotten together to kind of form this backbone of the government with Iturbide at his head. Now, this group, this Mexican Congress, is not particularly thrilled with what Iturbide has just done, declaring himself emperor and above everybody else. The Congress, this group of wealthy landowners, this upper middle class, wealthy class, really favors a republic. And wants to kind of look toward what the U.S. has done in the North instead. Iturbide doesn't want that. He wants to maintain control. He's got the backing of the army up until he doesn't. He's not able to bring in the tax revenue from the Creole population, the members of Congress, that is needed to continue to maintain that army. So if he can't pay the army's no longer supporting him as much. He starts to lose power. Support kind of shifts to this other man, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, General Santa Anna, who we'll get to in a moment. And with the support of the members of Congress, they're able to overthrow Iturbide about a year into his rule as emperor. And Mexico becomes a republic, kind of. So, caudillos in Mexico. Despite Mexico's shift toward Republican form of government, or at least the idea of Republican form of government, they're not very experienced with it. Similar to South America, they tend to favor military leadership, particularly this man right here, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, that general who had kind of been the rallying point for the Republicans, stands out amongst them and winds up becoming the president of Mexico, and will become president either through military means or semi-democratic means, different times, 11 different times over a period of about 22 years. This 22-year period, even when Santa Anna is not president, is really dominated by Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, this guy who had initially been this champion of Republican government. But during this 22-year period of time, he starts to roll back a lot of those reforms, reverses a lot of the democratic progress that Mexico had been trying to make. He even declares at one point, starts calling himself the Napoleon of the West, kind of signifying that he was going to be this imperial type figure. And at times, Santa Anna's rule did become dictatorial. He started to completely ignore the other branches of government and simply do what he wanted because he had the backing of the military, because he was seen as this great military leader and the one man who could kind of keep Mexico safe and free. It may be ironic then that his downfall becomes partially linked to a failed war, in particular a failed war with the US. This war with the United States really has its starting point with a rebellion in 1835. In 1835, Texas, which was a territory of Mexico at that time, goes into rebellion, and they want to create their own independent country. And Santa Anna organizes to put down this rebellion, but is unsuccessful in doing so. And the Texans are able to effectively separate themselves and create their own independent country, the Lone Star Republic, the Republic of Texas. But at the end of that war, there was dispute over what was and wasn't Texas. The Texans had said they had fought the war and created an independent nation, which is highlighted here in purple. Santa Anna and the Mexicans said, no, no, no. Yes, you've got your own independent country, but it is only this small territory here. But for a few years, it winds up not being a big flare-up, not a big issue, up until the Lone Star Republic, the independent state of Texas, decides to join the United States of America and be officially annexed into the U.S. And now this border dispute becomes a much bigger issue. And when American soldiers cross that line and start moving toward what they see as the border, but the Mexicans had not agreed to, that triggers a fight. And that fight becomes a war. And that 3-year war goes very badly for Mexico. And at the end of that 3-year war, Mexico will lose about half of its territory. Between what it lost with Texas, now it's going to lose California, Nevada, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of other states as well, Utah. That was all once part of Mexico. And as a result of the Mexican-American War, the United States gains that territory. So Santa Anna, this military genius, loses that war, starts to lose favor, comes kind of back to power for a little while, but is still seen as somewhat ineffective, and eventually exits the scene. Now, the next major leader to come into Mexican history is Benito Juarez, this man right here. Now, Juarez winds up being president from 1858 to 1872, having a long and steady and fairly stable rule as president of Mexico. And he is going to work as president to weaken the power of the military and politics so that they don't have another Caudillo president. He wants to weaken that military and separate the military from the political sphere. And he also wants to push back against the rich landowners, those caudillos and those who had really funneled money and support toward them. And in order to break up the power of the wealthy, he pushes for a redistribution of wealth, or more specifically, a redistribution of land, breaking up the large estates into smaller pieces so that the poor have their own land to farm and their own land to work, and the wealthy aren't as wealthy. This has the side effect of also increasing the political power of the poor within Mexico, and is an important step toward the Mexican Revolution becoming a revolution toward a true republic in the way that we see it today. Like I said, this isn't a complete story of the Mexican Revolution, but it gets us through an important period. And I do hope that you learned something here and that you enjoyed the lesson. And I will certainly see you next time.